What did your team find there?
Yeah, so what we have found is traditionally, especially in Gauteng, which is highly urbanized, and there's a lot of contestation for land and services and housing and that sort of thing. We found a lot of protests there, and also people seem to find it easier to organize. They more readily are able to have protests, etc. And that's always been the trend since we've been monitoring protests since 2004. But over the last year, a new trend has emerged that in the Eastern Cape and other more rural provinces as well, but specifically in this case, the Eastern Cape actually for the first time had more protests than Gauteng and the most protests in the country. And this was very interesting because the Eastern Cape, it's not a highly urbanized province. So we saw a lot of protests in Nelson Mandela Bay, and we know there's some tension down in that area, but also in places like Makana, where Grahamstown, the city of Grahamstown, there's very clearly very poor governance in that municipality. The municipality, in many ways, has very clearly collapsed. So we've seen a number of protests there. So these protests in smaller towns and more rural areas in the Eastern Cape are now coming to the fore. And, this is also worrying. It's of course worrying on an ongoing basis that there's protests in highly built-up areas like Johannesburg and Cape Town, but they are highly populated, and they have large informal settlements and large very populated urban townships. But in smaller municipalities, we have seen people have expressed more patience with government. Now, that seems to be possibly changing. The data shows that this increase in protests, specifically in the Eastern Cape, is maybe showing that protests are spreading to new areas in the country, that they are becoming more entrenched. And once they become entrenched, we know we have a lot of repeat protests in areas where we have protests. They keep occurring again and again.
Now, if those protests continue to take place, they keep occurring again and again, as you just said, do you have data that shows what kind of impact these protests have? Because if the protests are continuing, does that mean that the things that these people are protesting about is not being taken care of once they've got the attention of those office bearers at municipality and local government level?
Yes, it is. Protests they're very dynamic, and they are a real concern. So we've seen what happens with protests is they also become increasingly more violent. So the impact on protests in a locality is by and large quite negative. We see that in a municipality, in quite a poor area, infrastructure is destroyed. You see roads holes are dug in roads, tires are burnt on roads, which affects the road. Traffic lights are torn down, trucks are torched, municipal buildings are torched. This has a direct impact on people using services in those poor areas, and it has a direct impact on people's quality of life. I mean, people are worse off for especially these what we sometimes see very violent protests, and it's not a good thing. I mean, which isn't to say that people don't have a right to protest and they're not protesting for valid reasons, but the impact is often very, very negative. We often see as well municipalities seem unable or unwilling to negotiate with communities who do protest. We often see, and for the most part, communities are protesting for a very valid reason. They are often protesting as a last resort. They're often protesting after failing to engage with a very poor ward councillor or a very poor local council, as I said earlier in the case of Grahamstown, just as one example, in the Eastern Cape, Makanda. And, so it often shows up failures in many ways in the municipality, and you'll see even during the protest very poor coordination between communities protesting and the local police force and the local council, which actually drives the protest up and makes it worse and worse, makes it more violent as people become more frustrated, and in many cases we see this. So it can have a very negative detrimental impact. And we do see a lot of very poor coordination from the council side, both during the protest and afterwards. Very poor follow-up, often, in many cases, in municipalities which are being poorly run, we see no follow-up. We don't see issues being addressed.
Very telling information there. Kevin Allen, the MD of Municipal IQ, thank you so much for your time this morning.